Nowadays, there are almost 2 billion young people in the world. 30% of the global population is under 24. The medical device market is projected to grow from an estimated $455 billion in 2021 to more than $650 billion in 2028. Despite the rapidly increasing growth predicted in the medical device market, this sector has been dominated by the development of devices for adults. Medical devices for children are not in the center of interest, unfortunately. Pediatric medical devices are more than 10 years behind their adult counterparts. Usually, pediatricians and pediatric surgeons are frequently forced to adapt adult medical devices to fit the smallest patients. Currently, medical devices designed for children must fulfill the same regulatory framework as medical devices for adults to enter the commercial market, to enter the European market as well. In October last year, the European Parliament adopted an interesting resolution emphasizing disparities in medical device access among the EU countries, particularly for pediatric and rare diseases treatments. The resolution emphasized the need for a clear working definition of an orphan device within the European Union law to facilitate the adoption of standardized terminology across the whole EU. The European Parliament urged the European Commission to introduce appropriate regulations for orphan and pediatric medical devices while ensuring patient safety. The lack of dedicated regulations for pediatric medical devices not only hinders market development, but poses a risk to the health and safety of young patients. On the one hand, limited availability is a risk, while on the other, the consequence of this lack of availability is the adaptation of non-validated medical devices for pediatric use. As you all know, traditional medical liability laws are based on human error, making it unclear who is responsible when AI makes a wrong or harmful medical decision: the developer, the healthcare provider, the user. If an AI-driven pediatric medical device fails to diagnose a critical illness or malfunctions, should legal responsibility fall on the AI system? AI's black box nature makes it difficult to challenge medical decisions in court. So what are the liability options on the table? Civil liability provides the dual purpose of providing a means for victims of harm to be compensated, while also providing an economic incentive for those held liable to avoid continuing harmful conduct. Unfortunately, it is currently unclear how current liability regimes will consider AI harm in case of pediatric medical devices. For example, where AI systems make decisions, it may be difficult for a plaintiff to find a suitable defendant or for a court to determine the standard of care to be expected from an AI system. So let's move on to the first option: separate legal personality. It is generally agreed that current AI systems are not capable of being considered legal persons. But we don't know how the future will look like. The more sophisticated, generalized, and autonomous systems may change this assumption. On the other hand, some scholars insist that a separate legal personality for AI systems will never be necessary. I fully agree with this opinion. A practical issue of attributing liability directly to AI systems is that it leaves no clear pathways for compensation of victims. As AI systems are currently incapable of ownership, there are no assets that a victim could claim. To remedy this situation, some scholars have suggested the introduction of an insurance scheme funded by developers from which victims may claim. However, such a scheme may not adequately replace clear and fair liability rules. Another option, principal-agent rule. As most current AI systems in healthcare act as assistants to healthcare practitioners, some scholars have suggested extending principal-agent rules to govern liability. This approach is mostly modeled after the doctor and medical student relationship, whereby a medical student performs tasks under the supervision of a doctor. However, the doctor attracts liability for harm which occurs during the student's duties. This approach would ensure that there is always a human part of the decision-making process and would be in line with an AI in design philosophy called human in the loop. But this model is not appropriate for the medical devices, especially designed for children, as usually the patient doesn't need the supervision of a doctor. The most popular idea is the product liability idea. The inherent unpredictability of AI systems makes it usually difficult to define what constitutes a defect in the context of AI. It is usually difficult to prove that a defect caused harm. When using multiple systems together, as is common in healthcare, as you know, attributing fault may be often impossible. On December last year, 2024, the new directive on liability for defective products came into force. This directive is called PLD, new PLD directive. The PLD concerns the non-contractual liability of manufacturers for damages caused by lack of safety. The new PLD applies to products placed on the market, on the internal market, on the EU market, or put into use from December 9th, 2026. The new PLD does not remove the claimant's obligation to prove the product's defect, the incurred damage, and the causal link between the defect and the damaged. It means that patients who have suffered harm caused by medical device driven by AI are likely to face a considerably evidentiary burden when seeking resolution through product liability law. Fault-based remedies, another option. Fault-based liability is based on a person's intentional or negligent conduct which causes harm wrongfully. Key elements of such remedies are difficult to prove in a case of AI-driven medical device. Specifically, causation and fault. Causation is difficult to prove, as it may be difficult to show a flawed algorithm was the cause of a harm. The European Commission in September 2022 published legislative proposal related to AI liability. This proposal was called AI Liability Directive. In March this year, the European Commission abandoned this proposal. The vicarious liability. Establishing vicarious liability would be complicated, as currently there is no means of determining whether the AI systems acted negligently or what degree of control a medical practitioner should exert over an AI system. Accordingly, where there is no causation on the part of the physician, a patient may be left with no recourse. And the last option, strict liability. No-fault liability makes it significantly easier for victims to claim compensation by providing clear pathways to settle claims and removing the necessity of proving fault. No-fault systems also separate the compensation and the liability claims. But concerns raised about this approach have focused on the future development of AI systems. First, strict liability would subject stakeholders to material burden with no fair opportunity to avoid them. Normally, strict liability applies for unexpected harms, but where AI systems are implemented, it is difficult to determine how unexpected harms would be defined. Secondly, stakeholders would be at risk of reputational damage resulting from the occurrence of harm which is otherwise not foreseeable. Practically, strict liability could potentially be more expensive than litigation when administrative costs are coupled with more patients being eligible to claim. So, what are real options for us? To ensure AI benefits all children safely, policymakers must define clear liability rules for medical errors made by AI-driven medical devices. As you know, usually revolutions disrupt the existing orders. It was the case with the French Revolution, it was the case with the Industrial Revolution. It is also true now with the fourth Industrial Revolution, called the AI Revolution. The views and principles that have previously applied are often no longer suitable for the new reality. This will also be the case for the principles of liability for damages. The two pillars of liability in civil law are the principles of fault and the principle of risk. In both cases, damage and causal link must occur. In the case of fault-based liability, we must be able to attribute fault to the perpetrator. The burden of proof falls on the victim, the injured party. In the case of risk-based liability, there is no need to attribute fault to anyone, but the violator will bear responsibility. However, even in this case, the burden of proof remains on the injured party. Current systems are at the early stage of development. Today, we don't know what the final level of development will be. So who should be held responsible based on fault when, for example, the AI system developer has lost control over the system? It is justified to assign responsibility to the user who had no influence on the decisions made by the system. Who should hold the liability? The example of the abandoned AI liability directive shows that the issue of liability for damages is a regulatory challenge. It seems necessary to create a platform for exchanging views among developers, user representatives, lawyers, academics, to develop a new model of liability that meets the demands of the current liability. It appears that just the AI Act applies a risk-based criterion for the division of AI systems, and associated obligations, liability levels should be defined. Another idea is to think it over could be the establishment of a sui generis dispute resolution institution for harm caused by AI medical devices. This institution would replace litigation in the courts, hold broad investigative powers to access all relevant information, resolve dispute through reconciliation, award financial redress to victims, and importantly, learn and develop guidelines. Possible solutions include mechanisms used in no-fault systems, like, for example, in Sweden or New Zealand. It is essential to initiate a pan-European discussion as soon as possible on creating a completely new model of liability for damages caused by AI. The existing schemes must be rejected. It is necessary to adopt both the perspective of the user and the developer of new solutions. The new model must not be only unjust, nor should it hinder development. It cannot fail to motivate the improvement of faulty solutions while blocking the emergence of new ones. What should certainly be a point of reference for any potential, but I emphasize necessary, discussion is making liability dependent on the level of autonomy of the AI. Adopting a one-size-fits-all will not be optimal. And the second pillar of the future model should be the right, maybe the new human right, of the consumer, patient, any person to disconnect. The right to interact only with human. This right should apply in every situation, especially when it concerns children. Thank you for your attention.